One of the foremost pioneers in non-destructive testing is Samuel A. Wenk. Sam has been known to the NDT profession for decades. He's made tremendous contributions, and you're going to have an opportunity now to hear Sam say in his own words some of his experiences and share some of the tremendous lessons that he has learned that he wants to pass on to you in this very rapidly expanding and growing technology. Here's Sam Wenk.
Flattery won't get you any place, Chuck. I'd like to start off by saying this is an unrehearsed dissertation, and it's probably best entitled NDT Ancient History 101, updated and condensed for your generation. The good news is you don't need to take notes since there won't be a quiz. Since Chuck will transcribe significant dates and references for handouts. The bad news is you won't get any CEU credits. Further, I'll be referring to my notes on occasion as part of my age privilege of being entitled to claim old-timer's disease for memory lapses. So if you pardon my glances down, I'm referring to my memory bank. In late 40s and early 50s, NDTers were a small group trying to establish technical recognition to overcome the lack of an academic base. Most of us were into NDT because of interest generated by World War II or employer assignments due to increased requirements in government procurement specifications. Fortunately, in 38 and 41, two technical groups were organized and helped us. ASTM, which just celebrated its 50th anniversary since its formation in 1938, and ASNT, which in 1981 celebrated our 40th anniversary. We have our 50th anniversary coming up in 1991. These publications are available to you, the ASNT publications, through headquarters. ASTM helped NDT remarkably by forming a committee of a well-established society, ASTM, which has been in business since the turn of the century. We were motivated by a couple of old quotations. He who cannot remember the past is condemned to repeat it, and experience is the best teacher. So we sought out those who had the experience and profited by their mistakes, and who were glad to share it on a mutual exchange basis. By 1950, in E7, we were able to put together a basic philosophy, NDT, which conformed to the old rule: if you don't violate the laws of nature, anything can become possible. This 5-step philosophy is simple and has survived the test of time. 1. The first step in NDT is selecting and supplying a suitable form and distribution of energy from an external source to the test object. 2. Modifying the energy distribution within the test object as a result of discontinuities or variations in material properties which correlate to service reliability, a very important point. 3. Detecting a change in energy properties by a sensitive detector. 4. Indicating or recording the energy measurement in a form useful for interpretation. And 5. Interpreting the indication and judging corresponding serviceability of the test object. one very important point for all of you to remember is NDT problems are specific unto themselves, and as such demand specific solutions. Fortunately, these thoughts and words have not been lost in time. They can be found in both the ASMT Handbook editions of 1959 and 1988, and are summarized in an ASMT summary entitled Choosing a NDT, available for a modest price to both members and non-members of ASMT. This is something you should get, the ASMT catalog. You'll see what I mean about a modest price. The summary also contains excerpts from Alex Verey's landmark NASA report number 3079. Also of easier access by your generation are reprints and materials evaluation of two historic ASMT honor lecture featuring the first papers by Dr. Lester on RT and Dr. Floyd Firestone on UT, both of which thoroughly cover the basics of these methods. These were first published, Lester 1923 and Firestone's in 1948. Reprint dates in materials evaluation are April 1981 for Lester's and January 1984 for Firestone's. I found these to be very useful in teaching young engineering graduates, and in particular graduate students who, lacking this history, feel that the profession started the day they learned that non-destructive was not hyphenated instead of one word.
Sam, excuse me just a minute. You mentioned the Lester honor lecture, and I think you gave the honor lecture here in the late 60s, didn't you?
It was 1968, and it was a very humbling experience because I realized that Dr. Lester had been in the audience for at least the first 10 years that the Lester lecture was given, and nobody ever really paid a tribute to Dr. Lester, so I just considered a tribute was an honor, and the best way to give him the tribute was to resurrect his first paper, which I hasten to add was published in 1923. Now, what makes that significant and humbling for me is the fact that during that period that I worked with Dr. Lester as a member of his committee in the 50s, I reached the conclusion I was a contemporary of Dr. Lester's. Actually, at the time he wrote that paper, I was 8 years old. I hardly think that's being called a contemporary. So I think it is a very excellent experience for you to repeat that. Along that line, there are a few things in the history of NDT that you should also know about as to how certain things get cast in bronze or concrete or clay, depending on your viewpoint. Did you ever stop and consider why in radiography we have 2 T-holes in the penetranders? That was because in 1922, Dr. Lester wrote what is now the equivalent of radiography in modern industry, published by Eastman Kodak, first in 1931. That is well worth remembering. in that paper, he summarized sensitivity formula and came to the conclusion he had 1.5% sensitivity, but noted he felt that 2% was a much better industrial average. Consequently, everybody picked that up. Somewhere along the line, there was work done which unfortunately was classified because it was work performed by the AEC, for whether that same sensitivity applied to film side penetrators as well as source side. That work is buried in the archives, and the one person that has access to it and hopefully someday will find the time to resurrect it is Bob Hardison. The other thing, did you ever figure out or think about why 2.25 megahertz has become a sacred cow in the codes and standards? When Dr. Firestone was developing the supersonic reflectoscope back in the 40s, unfortunately his laboratory was the next building at the University of Michigan to the newly installed cyclotron, which was using early non-shielded klystrons that operated in 2.5 megahertz. So every time they came on the air, they blew him off the air at 2.25. Consequently, the easiest thing for him to do at that point in time, since his instrument was very narrow banded, since it was using X-cut quartz crystals, the easiest thing in the world was for him to drop back to 2.25 and proceed with his work. Little points of history I thought you should know about.
Well, Sam, I know that you've had a long and very interesting career in non-destructive testing, and I think it might be appropriate for you just to maybe give us a little of your own history and how you started in non-destructive testing.
I got started in non-destructive testing, Chuck, through the usual U.S. Army mentality. In case anybody is interested, military intelligence ain't. I was pulled in December of 1940 when we were not in a state of emergency by being repeatedly asked to volunteer to transfer from artillery, where I was very comfortable as a reserve officer, to ordnance, which had to do with the manufacture, production of arms and ammunition, and also such highfalutin subjects as figuring out range tables and other math which I was no longer cognizant of. So after repeated no's and exchange of letters, I got the final letter, which I had been showing all these to my stupid employer, who was the usual steel mill mentality, where I was an open hearth metallurgist in charge of the quality of molten steel from the blast furnaces on, to discover that he thought I was hitting him up for a raise, and I only had one recourse from the Army, which was either to volunteer or report to my draft board. When you're age 25 and single and on the verge of getting engaged, this was absolutely no incentive. So consequently, I volunteered for a year's active duty. At the end of the year, which would have been up on December the 16th, 1941, unfortunately those friendly little folks who gave us Pearl Harbor didn't wait, and something like 5 years later I got out. During that time I learned quite a bit from various smart people, including the civil servants in the Ordnance Department, and soon found out that many of my bright engineering ideas as a young engineer had not withstood the test of time back in the 20s and 30s when we were in an economic depression in this country and were drilling our reservists and National Guard with broomsticks and stovepipes for cannon. I got exposed to RT when in 1942 the Ordnance Department in Washington, without a word of warning, sent us a huge shipment of something called a betatron. Consequently, we found out that was to go into U.S. Steel castings in Pittsburgh. Oh, excuse me, Fort Pitt Steel castings in Pittsburgh, where gun mounts were being cast and other critical structures based on the design theory, if it doesn't work the first time, add more iron. As far as mag particle is concerned, I learned about that when we got our first equipment from Magnaflux Corporation for use on armor-piercing shot, and soon discovered there was an awful lot more to non-destructive testing that was very interesting and intriguing, and decided I wanted to have a career in it. Figuring that it would take a couple of years before I could carve out an employer who was interested in me and I was interested in them, in 1948 I went to Battelle Institute to set up, in cooperation with Bob McMaster, an effort in creating an R&D lab in NDT. Thanks to the cooperation of the manufacturers, we were soon able to equip a laboratory which we used for their showcase and vice versa, in exchange for which we had access to the industry problems, which gave us a marketplace to operate in. So that's where the whole thing started, Chuck, and went from there on, and back in the early 50s, as we had to correct the mistakes we made early in World War II, more and more developments took place, and it became a fantastic place to work. The walls and corners here are filled with the plaques and trophies that I was given upon retirement. These are very satisfactory to be honored by one's peers, but my own satisfaction derives from an unsolicited, unrehearsed testimonial which was given to me on the night of my retirement dinner from Southwest Research Institute, which Chuck has a copy of and will plug into this. That, to me, represents the greatest satisfaction, and as Chuck will tell you, occupies a spot of honor on the wall.
Now, about a year and a half ago, Sam, you found out that you were a pretty sick young man, and the prognosis was not really that good at that time, And, you know, speaking personally for me and all the other many friends that you have, we're just tremendously amazed at your positive attitude that you've had through this time of illness. And I was just curious if you'd share with us what the motivation was that has kept you going for this long period of time through your sickness.
Well, there are more than one steps to the motivation. Number one, like every other mortal, you suddenly wake up to the fact that we're not immortal. And I've been guided over the years by a bit of philosophy from one of our better American philosophers, amongst others, whose name you should recognize, Will Rogers. I fortunately ran across this back in the late 30s. Please recognize the fact it was paraphrased by me and was not accurate. Quote, "We are here for just a short time and pass on. So get a few laughs and do the best you can. Live your life so that when you lose, you go out ahead," unquote. Which is a very strong bit of philosophy to hang on to. The other motivating factor, as I said earlier, in realizing we're not mortal, I have left things undone which I should have done to get things in order. That was a strong motivation to put my own personal house in order and make sure everything was neat and buttoned up. But last, by no means the least, and probably the most positive motivating factor, was the support of my wife, Jean. We agreed from day one that we're going to take one day at a time and keep our life as normal as possible. And we've managed to do that. I've had time with our 2 grandchildren and thoroughly enjoyed it. My time with Jean has been well spent. And when the time comes, I go out of here with a clean slate as far as I'm concerned.
Well, Sam, mentioning Jean, your lovely wife, she just came in, and it's very nice of her to join you now in this little bit of history, because she has been such a very significant part of at least the last 10 or 15 years of your history anyway. So why don't you introduce...
20.
Make it 20, okay. Why don't you introduce your wife to everybody?
Christmas greetings from both of us. This is my big support program, my wife Jean.
And enjoyed every minute of it, especially the ASNT part of Sam's life, and meeting such super people like you, Chuck.
In fact, Sam was telling me you're going to take your level 3 examinations pretty soon. You're just about qualified for it now.
For something, at any rate.
Level 3 in corporate finance.
I balance the checkbook.